It started with a whisper that echoed through the gilded halls of the palace, brushing past the crystal chandeliers and the marble floors, a whisper that spoke of secrets no one outside the royal circle could have imagined. Royal aides, those who had dedicated their lives to serving the monarchy with loyalty and discretion, began to murmur among themselves. Something was happening, something that was shattering the carefully constructed illusion of Prince Harry and Meghan Markle. And for those on the inside, the truth was more shocking than anything they could have prepared for. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. Imagine being a palace aide, someone who has spent decades navigating tradition, hierarchy, and unspoken rules. You are trained to observe without speaking, to anticipate the needs of the royals before they even arise, and to exist almost invisibly behind the velvet curtains. Yet suddenly, you find yourself in the center of chaos, a storm that nobody anticipated, a storm caused by the very couple everyone expected to embody grace, charity, and dignity. How do you react when the people you serve, the couple you admire from afar, are demanding things so outrageous that even seasoned staff are left stunned? The first reports trickled in quietly, almost as if the aides themselves were afraid of being overheard. The whispers described rituals so peculiar that they seemed more appropriate for a private cult than a member of the British royal family. Harry, the once beloved prince with a penchant for charm and mischief, was allegedly engaging in practices that left palace staff bewildered. Aides watched in secret, documenting behaviors that seemed to border on obsession, small ceremonies repeated with meticulous care in rooms usually reserved for privacy and discretion. And then there was Meghan. From the moment she arrived, she was a force that could not be ignored. The stories told by staff painted a picture of a woman who demanded the impossible, whose requests escalated from the unusual to the outright audacious, and whose presence turned every routine into a complex, high-stakes negotiation. Some demands were logistical: a certain color of napkins for tea, a specific brand of water in her private quarters. Others bordered on psychological warfare: instructions on who could speak to her, what tone they could use, and when certain aides were allowed to breathe in her vicinity. It seemed that no detail was too small for her scrutiny, and no request too minor to escape her notice. These revelations, once contained within the quiet corridors of Buckingham Palace and Kensington Palace, began to leak. Staff who had been silenced for years by loyalty, fear, or simple exhaustion were beginning to speak out. And their accounts did not just describe minor inconveniences. They described a world turned upside down. A world where the line between privilege and excess was blurred, where the consequences of saying the wrong word could ripple through the staff hierarchy with astonishing speed. What makes this story so compelling now is the context in which it emerges. The royal family, for centuries, has operated under a veil of tradition, secrecy, and public diplomacy. Every action, every smile, every gesture is calculated. When insiders speak, it is because the breach of protocol is so significant that silence is no longer an option. This is why what the aides are revealing is not just gossip. It is an unprecedented glimpse into the inner workings of a family whose public image has always been meticulously curated. These are not the rumors of tabloids. These are observations from people who are on the inside. People who have devoted their careers to serving royalty and have risked everything to share the truth. The story is layered. At its core, it is about power, influence, and control. Harry, the prince who once captured hearts with his rebellious charm, is now allegedly performing rituals and exhibiting behaviors that leave aides questioning not only his judgment, but his very sanity. Meghan, meanwhile, is orchestrating her own narrative behind the scenes, issuing demands so extraordinary that even the most seasoned staff are left reeling. Together, they are a dynamic that, according to insiders, has disrupted the rhythm of palace life in ways that have never been seen before. But what makes this tale irresistible is not just the shock of the rituals or the audacity of the demands. It is the human element, the way ordinary people are caught in extraordinary circumstances. Staff who have worked tirelessly to maintain discretion are now faced with moral dilemmas. Do they remain silent and protect themselves, or do they speak out and risk everything to reveal the truth? There is fear, yes, but there is also a profound sense of justice. A feeling that the world deserves to know what is happening behind the polished smiles and photo-ready appearances. Consider the first dinner that aides described. On the surface, it was a simple royal function. Plates meticulously arranged, floral centerpieces perfectly symmetrical, and conversation flowing with polite etiquette. But behind the scenes, the tensions were palpable. Staff recount how Harry insisted on a precise sequence of rituals before sitting down. A sequence that was never explained, only enforced. Meghan, seated at the head of the table, issued instructions to the catering team with a level of scrutiny that bordered on obsession. Every glass had to be a certain distance from the plate, every napkin folded at an exact angle, every dish seasoned to specifications that only she knew. The aides who tried to comply found themselves walking a tightrope between error and embarrassment, anxiety gnawing at them with every step. It is moments like these that give us a window into the complex, sometimes contradictory nature of this couple. Harry, often seen as the more approachable and relatable member of the monarchy, is allegedly engaging in behaviors that are highly ritualistic, private, and almost inexplicably bizarre. Meghan, often lauded in public for her charisma and poise, is shown through these accounts as a commanding presence who will stop at nothing to shape the world around her to her specifications. Together, they create an environment that is intoxicating, exhausting, and, according to aides, occasionally terrifying. And yet, these accounts are not without nuance. Some aides describe moments of genuine warmth, moments when Harry's charm and Meghan's empathy shone through. There were brief respites, fleeting glimpses of the couple the public thought they knew. But these were overshadowed by a pattern that could not be ignored, a relentless drive to control, to orchestrate, to demand, and to perform. It is this tension between the human and the performative, between the relatable and the extraordinary, that makes this story so compelling and so shocking. Now, you might be wondering, why is this story being told now? Timing is everything. In the wake of recent royal events, public scrutiny has intensified. Every move Harry and Meghan make is dissected, every appearance analyzed. And as their influence grows outside the traditional royal sphere, so too does the importance of understanding the truth behind the curated images. Insiders are coming forward because the stakes have never been higher. The palace is evolving, the monarchy is under pressure, and the world is watching. But the most shocking part of all, even within the palace walls, the aides who first whispered about these rituals and demands could not have imagined what was about to unfold. Secrets that had been tightly held for years began to surface. Documents and testimonies started to paint a picture far more extreme than anyone anticipated. And the world outside had no idea that the story they were about to hear would change everything they thought they knew about Harry and Meghan. So, we ask you, how does one balance privilege with responsibility? How does one navigate power when every decision is scrutinized and every demand can ripple through a centuries-old institution? And more importantly, what happens when those who are meant to serve find themselves caught in the middle of a storm they did not create? The answers lie in the stories that follow. Stories of rituals, of demands, of staff caught in impossible positions. Stories that reveal a side of the monarchy rarely seen, a side that is at once human and extreme. And as you listen, remember this. What comes next is based on insider accounts, people who risked everything to bring the truth to light. These are not fantasies. They are the recollections of those who saw it all, who lived it, and who survived it. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. Have you ever walked into a room and immediately sensed that nothing would ever be the same again? That's exactly how the palace staff felt the first time Meghan Markle and Prince Harry stepped through the grand doors together. The air shifted instantly, almost imperceptibly at first, like the flicker of a candle flame in a vast cathedral. But soon, every aide, every footman, every member of the household staff realized this was no ordinary couple. This was a storm arriving in human form, dressed impeccably and smiling on cue for the cameras, yet harboring a reality that no one outside those gilded walls could imagine. Staff who had been serving the royals for decades, who had witnessed the quiet dignity of tradition and the subtle demands of palace life, were suddenly thrown into a new world. One staff member, who requested anonymity for fear of professional repercussions, described the moment with words that still send shivers through anyone who hears them. It wasn't just the arrival, they said. It was the energy, the way they moved, the way everyone else felt small, invisible, and yet responsible for anticipating every whim before it even existed. The arrival began like any other public-facing engagement. Photos were staged, smiles rehearsed, and speeches polished. But behind the polished veneer, something else was happening. Harry, once the carefree prince whose rebellious antics charmed the world, was focused, precise, almost ritualistic. There were subtle patterns to his movements, little gestures that aides quickly learned to interpret. The way he adjusted his cufflinks, the precise angle he took when greeting staff, the particular words he used when speaking privately. It all had a rhythm, a choreography that seemed almost hypnotic. Some staff even whispered about a kind of pre-arrival ritual Harry performed alone before each public appearance, behaviors they didn't understand but couldn't ignore. And Meghan? From the very beginning, she asserted her presence in ways both subtle and dramatic. A soft correction to a footman's posture here, a pointed glance to a housekeeper's expression there. Every word, every movement, calculated not just to be noticed, but to control the room's energy. Requests started small at first, a preferred type of sparkling water, a specific brand of soap in her private quarters. But the aides quickly realized that these small demands were only the beginning. Meghan had a way of escalating expectations almost imperceptibly, until compliance wasn't just desired, it was demanded. Imagine being a palace aide in that moment. You are trained for discretion, for anticipating needs before they are voiced. You are trained to smile, to nod, to move silently through grand halls. Yet suddenly, you are walking a tightrope where any misstep could carry consequences. And all the while, the couple projects perfection to the cameras, projecting charm and relatability. The contrast is dizzying. You are simultaneously starstruck and terrified, awed and exhausted. The aides soon realized that the initial impressions were only the tip of the iceberg. There were signs, subtle at first, that things were not quite normal. Aides whispered about meetings that seemed to have no agenda, conversations that ended with strange instructions, and private moments where Harry's behavior became more enigmatic, more ritualistic, and, at times, downright bizarre. One aide described Harry's tendency to repeat actions in exact sequences, adjusting objects on a table, performing small physical gestures, or speaking certain phrases in a precise order, before he felt comfortable entering a room. To outsiders, these behaviors would appear insignificant. To the staff, they were a pattern that could not be ignored. At the same time, Meghan's influence grew with almost terrifying speed. Staff found themselves constantly recalibrating. What had been acceptable yesterday could be unacceptable today. One aide recalled the early days of Meghan's arrival. We were told she liked a particular type of flower in her suite. We got it wrong. She didn't yell, she just looked disappointed. But that look was enough. We never made that mistake again. Such stories were common. Small missteps, invisible to the outside world, could carry heavy emotional weight behind palace walls. The contrast between public perception and private reality was astonishing. To the world, Harry and Meghan were a modern fairy tale, progressive, relatable, and charismatic. But inside, staff observed a couple whose behavior was intense, exacting, and sometimes unexplainable. It created a tension that simmered beneath the surface, one that would only intensify over time. The aides had to balance admiration, fear, and incredulity in equal measure. Yet, despite the challenges, there were moments that seemed almost humanizing. Harry occasionally displayed flashes of warmth that reminded staff why he had been beloved. Meghan, too, could be engaging, charming, even disarmingly empathetic at times. But these moments were fleeting, often followed by an abrupt return to strict control, rituals, and demands. The staff learned quickly that in this environment, equilibrium was fragile, and the smallest shift could ripple through the household with unforeseen consequences. The first dinner attended by Harry and Meghan illustrated this perfectly. On paper, it was a straightforward affair, a formal palace meal with carefully arranged seating, exquisite table settings, and ceremonial precision. But behind the scenes, aides described a different scene entirely. Harry performed private actions before taking his seat, meticulous adjustments that dictated the rhythm of the entire meal. Meghan issued precise instructions about the placement of cutlery, the temperature of the soup, and even the angle of the napkins. Staff scrambled to comply, anxiety gnawing at them with every movement. A single misstep could trigger a subtle but noticeable shift in the atmosphere. A glare, a silence, a redirection of attention. Aides began to observe contradictions, moments that made them question everything. Harry, the prince who had always been praised for his empathy, sometimes seemed rigid, almost mechanical in his routines. Meghan, the public advocate for kindness and empowerment, could be unyielding, issuing directives that seemed to disregard the humanity of those around her. How could the couple be both relatable and demanding, charismatic yet controlling? How could they project warmth to the world while creating tension behind closed doors? These contradictions were a source of fascination, fear, and quiet resentment among staff. And then came the first instance that truly shocked the palace staff. A private meeting, unannounced and unprecedented, during which Harry insisted on a series of actions and statements that aides later described as ritualistic beyond belief. Meghan, seated nearby, observed with an intensity that made even the most seasoned aides uneasy. Requests were issued in a precise order, demands repeated, and the room seemed to hum with an energy that was impossible to describe. Staff later confided that they had never seen anything like it, and that one misstep could have led to public embarrassment had it leaked outside the palace. As aides tried to navigate this new reality, they realized that each encounter with Harry and Meghan required heightened vigilance. The learning curve was steep, the consequences of error significant, and the emotional toll relentless. Over time, the staff began to see patterns emerge, patterns of behavior, escalation, and expectation that painted a picture far different from the public persona of the royal couple. By the end of the first week, it was clear the arrival of Harry and Meghan had shifted the palace environment in a way that no staff member had anticipated. Some described a sense of unease that persisted long after the couple had left a room. Others noted the constant recalibration required just to meet expectations. Every gesture, every step, every word was measured and calculated, and staff were caught in the middle. And yet, the aides who survived these early days learned something crucial. This was only the beginning. The behaviors, the demands, and the rituals were escalating. Patterns that had seemed curious or eccentric at first were solidifying into routines, expectations, and pressures that would soon test every ounce of loyalty, discretion, and resilience. The palace, a place that had withstood centuries of tradition, was now confronting a reality shaped not by history, but by the unrelenting intensity of one couple. So the question remains, how did the palace staff survive in this environment? How did they navigate the tension between admiration, fear, and obligation? And what did they witness in those first weeks that would foreshadow the extraordinary stories they would later share? The answers, according to insiders, are shocking, and some of what they saw in those early days would haunt them for years. But what came next would change everything, and no one could have predicted the level of chaos that was about to unfold. Have you ever wondered what someone does when they think no one is watching? In the world of Prince Harry, according to palace insiders, the answer is stranger, darker, and far more meticulous than anyone could have imagined. Aides who had spent decades navigating the subtleties of royal life describe behaviors that were equal parts ritual, obsession, and psychological intrigue. Actions that left them questioning whether they were witnessing eccentricity, devotion, or something else entirely. It began subtly, almost imperceptibly, in the quiet corners of the palace. Early on, staff noticed that Harry's movements followed patterns that defied casual observation. He would enter rooms only after performing precise adjustments to objects on tables, ensuring alignment of lamps, chairs, and even the angle of framed photographs. Aides describe him tracing imaginary lines on the floor with the tips of his shoes, checking them twice, sometimes thrice, before finally taking a seat. To an outsider, these might have seemed like odd habits or quirks, but to those who served him, they were the prelude to rituals that would escalate in both complexity and intensity. One particularly unsettling ritual involved the morning routines of the prince. Aide accounts detail that Harry would rise at exact times each day, no matter the schedule, and conduct a sequence of activities that appeared almost ceremonial. He would arrange his clothes in precise order, align his personal items at exact angles on the dressing table, and perform movements that seemed part meditation, part meticulous exercise and symmetry. Staff often found themselves pausing in hallways to avoid being seen, unsure whether their presence would disrupt the ritual or provoke his ire. What made these rituals extraordinary wasn't just their precision, it was the underlying intensity. Harry reportedly engaged in repetitive behaviors with a focus that bordered on obsessive. Aides recall him walking through rooms multiple times, testing acoustics, checking light reflections, and adjusting objects in ways that no one else could perceive. One aide whispered that Harry appeared to be conversing with the walls, speaking quietly, as though receiving instructions or reassurance from unseen sources. Were these meditation practices, superstitions, or part of a larger psychological pattern that only Harry could fully understand? And then there were the objects themselves. Certain items in his private quarters reportedly held symbolic significance. Small tokens, trinkets, or gifts arranged on shelves or tables were moved daily, rotated, or placed in ritualistic sequences. Staff were warned never to touch these objects, and those who accidentally did were met with pointed reminders that these arrangements were personal and important. Some aides speculated that these rituals were a form of grounding or coping mechanism, a private system of control amid the chaos of royal life, but others feared they hinted at something deeper, more intense. One aide described an episode that still sends chills through the palace staff. Harry, according to their account, spent nearly 3 hours performing what they called a complex preparatory ritual before a private meeting. This involved moving chairs in precise alignments, reciting lines under his breath, and adjusting lighting to a level of exactness that seemed unnecessary, yet non-negotiable. When the meeting began, he appeared calm, collected, and entirely in command. But the aides who witnessed the preparation described feeling as if they had been part of an arcane ceremony, a performance with rules only he understood. It wasn't just physical rituals either. Harry reportedly engaged in verbal and mental routines, rehearsing conversations, predicting questions, and responding aloud to imagined queries. Staff overheard muttered words and phrases that seemed cryptic, a private dialogue that only he could follow. Some aides were fascinated, others were unnerved. One remarked, "It was like watching someone prepare for a battle no one else knew existed." The level of focus, the dedication, it was impressive but frightening. Interestingly, these behaviors were not isolated to private spaces. Staff noted that even during public engagements, traces of his rituals remained. The exact way he greeted individuals, the order in which he approached rooms, and the timing of his hand gestures all reflected a meticulous internal schedule. It was as though the rituals had become ingrained, influencing his interactions even when discretion would normally allow for spontaneity. Yet Harry's private rituals were only one part of the story. The aide accounts suggest that these practices sometimes created tension among staff, who had to navigate around them with care. A misalignment of an object, an accidental interruption, or a misjudged step could provoke subtle but pointed corrections. The pressure to anticipate his rituals added another layer of stress to the already demanding palace environment. Some aides confided that they developed their own strategies to survive, staying out of sight, observing patterns from afar, or pretending not to notice. Contradictions appeared frequently. Harry, often described publicly as relaxed and personable, could in private be exacting, precise, and, at times, almost obsessive. This duality fascinated staff. How could someone so charming, so approachable in the public eye, conduct such intense and exacting rituals in private? Aides speculated endlessly. Some suggested that these rituals were a form of stress management, a way to maintain a sense of order amid the pressures of royal duty. Others feared they hinted at deeper anxieties or even compulsive behavior that staff were unequipped to address. One of the most astonishing reports involved a ritual tied to personal reflection and decision-making. According to aides, Harry would retire to a private study, dim the lights, and arrange objects in a specific sequence while reciting thoughts aloud. The aides who accidentally glimpsed these sessions described them as like watching a ritualized meditation blended with meticulous planning. At times, he reportedly moved objects back and forth multiple times, adjusting angles, counting repetitions, and pausing to reflect before continuing. The precision and repetition were exhausting to watch, yet staff also admitted a sense of awe at the level of dedication. Despite the intensity, aides noted that there were moments of levity, rare glimpses of the human side of Harry amidst the rituals. On occasion, he would step away from the meticulous arrangements, laugh quietly, or offer a brief smile to those who happened to witness his lighter moments. These glimpses, however fleeting, created a contrast that made the rituals themselves even more surreal. Staff were left to reconcile the extraordinary discipline with the familiar warmth of a prince they had long admired. And yet, the rituals began to impact more than just Harry himself. They created an atmosphere that affected everyone around him. Staff found themselves tiptoeing around, uncertain whether their actions would interrupt or offend. One aide admitted that simply entering a room while Harry conducted a ritual could be terrifying. The need to anticipate his expectations, to remain invisible yet present, weighed heavily. Some aides described sleepless nights, anxiety, and a constant awareness that any misstep could have repercussions far beyond the immediate moment. It was during these private rituals that some of the most telling contradictions emerged. Harry, often seen as approachable and empathetic in public, became almost inaccessible in private. He communicated in patterns and sequences that only he could follow, leaving aides to guess at meaning. Some viewed this as eccentricity, others as a subtle form of control, a way to assert dominance in spaces where he felt he could. Either way, the effect on palace staff was undeniable. The aides' accounts suggest that these rituals were not just habits. They were systems of order and control that allowed Harry to navigate an environment fraught with expectations, scrutiny, and public attention. Yet the intensity, the precision, and the psychological demands placed on those around him created a tension that was palpable. Staff were caught between admiration and fear, loyalty and self-preservation, fascination and unease. One aide, reflecting on their experience, described the culmination of these rituals in a moment that would define the early days of Harry's private behavior. He spent hours preparing for a small internal meeting, they said. The care, the repetition, the attention to detail, it was almost ritualistic. And when it was over, he appeared completely composed, as if nothing had happened. But we knew something extraordinary had. These rituals, according to insiders, were just the beginning. They hinted at patterns of behavior that would shape interactions, demands, and expectations across the palace. They were a window into a mind operating at a level of precision few could understand, and the aides who observed them could not have anticipated the scale, the intensity, or the impact these private practices would have on everyone around them. So we have to ask, what drives someone to such extremes? Are these rituals harmless eccentricities, coping mechanisms for the immense pressure of royal life? Or do they reveal a deeper need for control? And as we will see in the chapters that follow, these private practices did not exist in isolation. They intersected with Meghan's own extraordinary demands, creating a dynamic that would redefine life inside the palace. But what came next would test the patience and loyalty of the staff like never before, and no one could predict the level of audacity that awaited them. Have you ever worked for someone whose requests start small, but escalate until nothing feels normal anymore? That was the reality for palace staff when Meghan Markle arrived with Prince Harry. At first, the demands seemed minor, preferences for tea, specific flowers, the temperature of a room. But the aides quickly learned that minor was only the beginning. What started as subtle guidance soon transformed into a relentless string of expectations, testing the patience, endurance, and creativity of even the most seasoned staff members. The first week was a crash course in understanding Meghan's world. Staff described her arrival as a wave of energy that swept through every corridor, every room, every office. Aides who had spent decades serving royals found themselves in a whirlwind of meticulous detail. Nothing was left to chance. One aide described it like this: "We were told she liked a certain brand of hand cream, a particular scent in the powder room, and that the pillows had to be arranged in a precise formation. It seemed manageable at first, until we realized there was an entire set of rules we hadn't even been told existed." Her demands were often presented casually, with a smile that masked the expectation of immediate compliance. A request for a specific shade of water glass or the perfect angle for a photograph might seem inconsequential to outsiders. But for the staff, these were tests of observation, patience, and precision. Missteps weren't just minor errors. They could trigger subtle but unmistakable disapproval. A glance, a pause in conversation, or an unexpected sigh became a silent reminder of the high standards expected. It wasn't just the quantity of demands, it was the creativity and audacity behind them. Meghan was said to insist on very specific conditions for public appearances. Exactly 20 minutes before a press event, certain aides needed to be stationed at particular spots, and only select staff were permitted near her. Meals had to be arranged in a precise sequence, lighting had to highlight her best features, and wardrobe choices were scrutinized down to the smallest detail. One aide recounted a day when they were tasked with arranging fruit on a plate in a visually harmonious pattern for a private breakfast. Failure, they said, would not be tolerated. The aides quickly realized that Meghan's attention to detail extended beyond physical arrangements. It touched every aspect of interpersonal interaction. Staff were instructed on tone of voice, pacing of speech, and even posture when addressing her. You could never speak casually, one aide recalled. Everything had to be measured, polite, careful, almost like performing a dance where one wrong step could create tension in the room. What made the situation even more challenging was the inconsistency. Meghan's expectations seemed to shift based on circumstances, moods, or perceived priorities. An instruction that was accepted on Monday might be invalid by Wednesday. One staffer admitted, "You had to be constantly alert, reading her cues, anticipating changes. It was exhausting, mentally, physically, emotionally." Some aides began keeping private logs, recording her requests and behaviors to try to maintain a semblance of order. Others simply learned to nod and comply, hoping their interpretation of the rules aligned with her expectations. The audacity of Meghan's demands was amplified by the public persona she maintained. To the world, she appeared charming, relatable, and empathetic. But behind palace walls, insiders described a sharp contrast. A woman who wielded influence with precision, orchestrating her environment with a mix of grace, authority, and strategic intensity. One aide confided that there were times when she seemed almost unapproachable, issuing commands that left staff scrambling to adapt instantly. Her expectations weren't confined to staff. They often involved Harry as well. Some aides observed that Meghan would coordinate with Harry on timing, sequencing, and logistics, creating an intricate system of preparation that bordered on obsession. They would meticulously plan events, rehearsals, and even casual moments to ensure they met her standards. Staff described an invisible pressure that permeated every interaction, a tension that demanded constant attention to detail and anticipation of needs before they were voiced. It's important to note that these demands were not just arbitrary. They were often calculated to reinforce control and order. Meghan, according to aides, had an acute awareness of the power dynamics within the palace. By setting strict expectations and enforcing them, she created a hierarchy in which staff were constantly striving to meet her standards, often at the expense of their own comfort and autonomy. This wasn't simply about preferences, it was about influence, perception, and authority. Some aides attempted subtle resistance, testing the limits of what could be negotiated or ignored. The results, according to insiders, were swift and unmistakable. Misalignment, hesitation, or perceived disrespect triggered corrective measures, ranging from pointed instructions to the silent withdrawal of engagement. Staff quickly learned that compliance was not optional. Those who hesitated, questioned, or misinterpreted her expectations risked professional embarrassment, stress, and in some cases, subtle retribution. Even within this high-pressure environment, there were moments of absurdity. One aide recalled being tasked with arranging dozens of tiny items in an exact pattern for a photo shoot, only for Meghan to request a complete rearrangement minutes later because the lighting had shifted slightly. Another recounted having to prepare a room at an exact temperature for a meditation session, adjusting curtains, furniture, and decorative objects until the desired energy was achieved. In each case, the staff's exhaustion grew alongside their awe and bewilderment. What compounded the challenge was the pace at which Meghan's demands escalated. What started as minor preferences evolved into complex systems of expectation. A simple task, like arranging a breakfast tray, could evolve into an elaborate set of instructions spanning multiple aids, requiring coordination, precision, and constant vigilance. The staff had to anticipate not just the immediate task, but the ripple effects, how one action could affect the next, and how each small misstep could cascade into larger consequences. Some insiders suggested that Meghan's demands were, in part, a reflection of her awareness of public perception. By controlling the behind-the-scenes environment, she could ensure that every public appearance, every photograph, and every statement reflected her desired image. It was a system of both preparation and protection, designed to minimize error and maximize impact. Yet, in doing so, the aides were caught in a cycle of constant adjustment, anxiety, and vigilance. And then there were the contradictions. Meghan, often publicly praised for empathy and advocacy, was described by staff as uncompromising and strategic in private. A simple request for assistance could become a test of diligence. A minor error in protocol could prompt a subtle but unmistakable correction. One aide noted that the challenge was balancing respect for her authority with maintaining their own professional integrity, a delicate line that grew narrower with each passing day. A particularly telling episode involved an entire team of aides preparing for a minor public engagement. The process, which typically would have taken an hour, stretched into several hours due to meticulous checks and repeated adjustments requested by Meghan. Flowers had to be replaced multiple times, seating arrangements altered, and wardrobe elements reevaluated for minor discrepancies. Staff described the scene as both exhausting and surreal, a testament to the combination of influence and control she wielded behind the scenes. Despite the intensity, some staff admitted to moments of admiration. The precision, strategic thinking, and vision Meghan exhibited were extraordinary. It became clear why she was such a formidable figure in public life. She applied the same rigor, intensity, and focus behind closed doors. But admiration was tempered by exhaustion, frustration, and the constant tension of meeting her expectations. As the weeks went on, the staff began to recognize patterns in Meghan's demands. Every request had layers of expectation, timing, and precision. Each interaction required acute awareness, anticipation, and sometimes creativity to interpret what was wanted before it was articulated. The pressure to comply became a constant, underlying force, shaping the rhythm of daily life in the palace. And yet, the aides also realized that this intensity would only escalate further. Meghan's demands were not static. They were dynamic, evolving with circumstances, moods, and ambitions. Every successful compliance seemed to set a new baseline, raising expectations incrementally. Staff began to understand that there was no end point, no final instruction. They were participants in a constantly shifting landscape of demands, testing limits, and expectations. So we have to ask, how far would these demands go? Could staff endure the relentless pace, the subtle corrections, and the ever-escalating expectations? And what impact would this have on the palace itself, the balance of tradition, hierarchy, and daily operations? The answers, according to insiders, would soon become apparent in ways no one could anticipate. But what came next would push the boundaries of palace protocol and human endurance, and the staff who witnessed it would never forget what unfolded. Have you ever felt trapped in a situation where your loyalty and survival are constantly at odds? That's exactly how palace staff felt as Meghan Markle's demands and Harry's rituals began to dominate their daily lives. For months, they had endured the constant tension, the endless sequences of precise expectations, and the psychological weight of performing flawlessly in a world where one misstep could ripple across the corridors of power. But there comes a point when patience wears thin, when whispered conversations become urgent, and when private frustrations evolve into collective action. This is the story of the staff revolt, the secret meetings, and the whispers that shook the foundation of the palace from the inside. The revolt did not happen overnight. It began subtly, as many revolts do, with hushed conversations in quiet hallways, shared looks of exasperation across crowded kitchens, and discreet comments during tea breaks. Aides, who had been conditioned to remain invisible, suddenly found themselves drawn together by a shared understanding. The situation had become unsustainable. One senior aide recounted. We realized we couldn't continue like this. The tension was suffocating. And yet, none of us wanted to be the first to speak out. There was too much at stake. The initial meetings were clandestine, held in broom closets, behind closed pantry doors, and in quiet corners of the palace gardens. Staff came with notes, observations, and carefully documented accounts of Harry's private rituals and Meghan's escalating demands. Every detail mattered. Timing, frequency, tone, and subtle gestures were meticulously recorded. They had learned that what seemed trivial to outsiders, arranging pillows, adjusting lighting, replacing flowers, was in fact part of a larger pattern of control that affected every aspect of palace life. These secret meetings were emotionally charged. Staff shared stories of exhaustion, anxiety, and humiliation. One housekeeper spoke of the moment she accidentally misaligned a chair during a breakfast preparation, and Meghan reportedly corrected her with a pointed glance and a detailed explanation of the proper sequence. Another aide described Harry's pre-meeting ritual, in which he repeated a set of precise motions, muttering under his breath, forcing staff to wait in silence until he deemed it complete. We were exhausted, frustrated, and scared, an aide admitted. It felt like we were constantly walking on eggshells in a minefield we didn't understand. The whispers that circulated in these clandestine gatherings were not just complaints, they were strategy sessions. Staff discussed patterns, brainstormed ways to anticipate demands, and devised silent ways to protect themselves and each other. They debated whether documentation of these behaviors could ever leave the palace without reprisal, weighing loyalty against personal well-being. Some aides suggested subtle resistance, like slightly delaying certain tasks or quietly adjusting procedures without attracting attention. Others advocated for discretion and endurance, arguing that surviving intact was the most practical form of revolt. But as weeks turned into months, the pressure intensified. Harry's rituals grew more elaborate, his expectations more exacting. Meghan's demands became audacious, escalating from practical requests to logistical orchestration that consumed entire teams. Staff morale began to fray. Some aides became ill from stress. Others considered leaving their positions entirely, and a few were quietly reassigned to less visible duties in an attempt to regain stability. The palace, a symbol of centuries-old order, was beginning to buckle under the weight of modern celebrity and relentless control. The revolt gained momentum when one aide proposed a radical idea: to document every encounter, every demand, every ritual in a systematic way. What started as notes in a personal journal evolved into a shared ledger, meticulously cross-referenced and updated daily. They tracked patterns of behavior, noted inconsistencies, and even logged emotional responses, creating a detailed record of life under Harry and Meghan. This archive became both a shield and a weapon, a way to protect themselves and a potential tool should they decide to expose the reality of palace life. Tensions rose further when a miscommunication during a high-profile event nearly caused public embarrassment. Meghan, reportedly unsatisfied with the arrangement of a press briefing, demanded immediate adjustments. Harry, distracted by his own private pre-event rituals, did not intervene. Staff scrambled, making rapid corrections while trying to maintain composure in front of media and dignitaries. That day, the aides realized that silent endurance was no longer sufficient. Something had to change. The revolt took on a psychological dimension. Staff began to strategize about communication, timing, and subtle signaling. They developed systems of alerts and cues to warn each other of impending scrutiny. One senior aide described it as a network of quiet solidarity, a way to support each other in an environment dominated by unpredictable expectations. It was not rebellion in the overt sense. It was survival, clever maneuvering to maintain dignity, and an attempt to restore a sense of balance. Yet, the stakes were higher than mere professional inconvenience. Those who participated in the secret meetings risked reprisal, alienation, or subtle punitive measures. Harry and Meghan's influence extended through the palace hierarchy, and crossing them could have career-ending consequences. Despite the risk, the staff persisted, motivated by a sense of moral and emotional necessity. We had to do something, one aide recalled. It wasn't about revenge. It was about protecting ourselves and each other from a situation that was spiraling out of control. The emotional tension in these gatherings was palpable. Staff shared moments of vulnerability, expressing the fear, anxiety, and exhaustion that had become a daily reality. One aide recounted how the stress had seeped into their personal life, affecting sleep, family relationships, and mental health. Another described a breakdown in the kitchen, where frustration and despair overwhelmed months of disciplined endurance. In these private spaces, aides found empathy and solidarity, a counterbalance to the relentless control exercised by Harry and Meghan. Despite the emotional strain, some aides found a strange sense of empowerment in these secret meetings. By speaking openly, documenting experiences, and strategizing collectively, they reclaimed a measure of agency. They were no longer passive observers of a surreal reality. They were participants in shaping it, however subtly. This empowerment, however, came with its own tension. Each step toward asserting autonomy carried the risk of discovery and consequence. The revolt also revealed the depth of contradictions in the royal couple's behavior. Publicly, Harry and Meghan were celebrated for their charisma, empathy, and relatability. Privately, however, staff described a relentless, controlling energy, a world of precise rituals and audacious demands that left everyone on edge. The aides, caught in the middle, were forced to reconcile these contradictory realities daily. How could someone be so charming and yet so exacting? How could public advocacy coexist with private imperiousness? These questions fueled the discussions in whispered corridors and quiet pantries. One particularly revealing incident involved a minor error during a ceremonial event. A staff member had misread a timing instruction and inadvertently placed objects in the wrong sequence. Meghan, according to insiders, addressed the situation not with overt anger, but with precise corrections that implicitly communicated dissatisfaction. Harry, engrossed in a pre-event ritual, remained unaware of the disruption until later. The incident became a case study among staff, demonstrating the interplay of rituals, demands, and subtle power dynamics that governed their lives. The aides' efforts to support each other culminated in a shared understanding. To survive, they had to communicate, document, and anticipate. They developed informal networks of information, sharing insights about preferences, patterns, and potential pitfalls. These whispered strategies became lifelines, allowing staff to navigate the increasingly demanding environment while maintaining professional composure. Yet even within these secret gatherings, tension remained. Some staff questioned whether they were overreacting, while others feared the consequences of collective documentation. Would speaking out ever be safe? Could the records they kept be used against them? The uncertainty added an emotional layer to the revolt, blending fear, solidarity, and quiet determination. The climax of the staff revolt, according to insiders, occurred during an event that brought together multiple departments for a coordinated function. Tensions were high, demands were escalating, and Harry's rituals were in full effect. Staff executed tasks with precision, but the pressure was palpable. In the moments before the event, a senior aide whispered to the team, "We need to stick together. Every eye is watching, and one mistake could unravel everything." It was a defining moment. The aides had transitioned from passive compliance to an active, strategic network of support, navigating a reality that seemed increasingly surreal. And yet, despite their efforts, they could sense that the challenges were far from over. The combination of Harry's private rituals and Meghan's escalating demands had created an environment that was unpredictable, high stakes, and emotionally taxing. Staff had found ways to survive, but the palace itself was under strain, and the insiders knew that the situation was evolving toward a breaking point. So we have to ask, how long could the aides maintain this delicate balance of loyalty, secrecy, and subtle resistance? Could their whispered strategies hold against the relentless pressure of the royal couple's exacting standards? And what events would finally push the palace staff to the edge, forcing them to confront the audacity of Harry and Meghan in ways no one anticipated? But what came next would expose the stark contrast between public perception and private reality, and the world would never look at the couple the same way again. Have you ever wondered how two seemingly perfect people can create chaos behind closed doors while maintaining an image of grace and charm for the world? That is exactly what palace staff witnessed with Harry and Meghan. On the surface, they were a picture-perfect couple, charismatic, polished, and media savvy, embodying the modern royal narrative. Cameras loved them, the public adored them, and interviews painted a story of relatability, empathy, and sophistication. But behind the velvet curtains and gilded doors, reality told a very different story. One of rituals, relentless demands, and a carefully orchestrated performance designed to maintain control while masking disruption. The aides who observe this dichotomy describe it as a constant cognitive dissonance. One senior staffer explained, "Publicly, they are flawless. But privately, it's an entirely different world. You have to learn quickly to separate the persona from the person. That's how you survive." Imagine being in that environment, walking a fine line between admiration and fear, where the polished smiles seen on television concealed meticulous demands, psychological pressure, and behaviors that defied understanding. Harry's private rituals, which had grown more complex over time, intersected seamlessly with Meghan's exacting expectations. The result was a dual reality in which public appearances required performance, while private life demanded perfection in unprecedented ways. Staff often had to anticipate needs that weren't voiced, decipher unspoken cues, and navigate sequences of behavior that could shift from day to day. It was a world where intuition became survival, and observation turned into a form of silent mastery. One particularly illustrative event involved a high-profile charity gala. To the cameras, Harry and Meghan were models of composure and charisma. They laughed, posed, and interacted with attendees effortlessly. But the staff preparing the environment behind the scenes described near-manic attention to detail. Lighting had to be adjusted multiple times, props meticulously aligned, and timing rehearsed in a sequence designed to create maximum visual impact. Any error, they knew, would have been magnified under the public eye. Yet even flawless execution offered no relief from the scrutiny of private expectations. The contrast was even more pronounced when Meghan's demands intersected with Harry's rituals. In one anecdote, Harry performed a pre-event sequence involving precise movements through the palace halls while aides waited silently to see when he would allow them to proceed with preparations. Meanwhile, Meghan issued instructions regarding seating, attire, and even the timing of hand gestures to ensure that every photograph aligned with her vision. Staff found themselves navigating overlapping systems of control, each invisible to the public but critical to maintaining the narrative of perfection. The cognitive dissonance wasn't limited to staff experience. It extended to public perception as well. Audiences around the world were presented with images of a harmonious, relatable, and modern royal couple. Interviews highlighted empathy, humanitarian focus, and a refreshing break from tradition. Social media amplified these perceptions, creating a global feedback loop of admiration. But behind the scenes, aides witnessed constant recalibration, tension, and correction, behaviors that were invisible to outsiders yet deeply affected everyone involved. Interestingly, the duality was sometimes strategic. Staff noted that Harry and Meghan appeared acutely aware of how their public personas could offset the intensity of their private demands. One aide recalled, "It's like they knew the cameras would see only the best moments. That gave them room to be exacting and demanding behind the scenes. We never knew if what we saw privately would ever reach anyone else, but we knew the public would never see the struggle it took to make it look effortless." In other words, every private ritual and every demand was, in a sense, a calculated investment in public image. The aides also observed that the need to maintain this dual reality created stress not only for them, but for Harry and Meghan as well. Behind the scenes, tension was palpable. Even small deviations from ritual or expectation could lead to subtle shifts in mood, which staff had to navigate carefully. Some aides reported feeling as if they were actors in a theater where the main performers were simultaneously staging perfection for the audience while enforcing a private set of rules behind the scenes. The stakes of this public-private split were high. The aides' accounts suggest that the couple's meticulous orchestration of image versus reality extended to nearly every aspect of palace life. Meals, schedules, guest interactions, and even casual hallway encounters became stages for both subtle control and visible performance. The constant vigilance required to maintain this balance was exhausting. Staff were forced to measure every movement, every word, every glance, ensuring that the private chaos did not spill into the polished public facade. This duality also created moments of striking contradiction. Harry, who was expected to be approachable, warm, and relatable in public, often appeared regimented, focused, and ritual-bound in private. Meghan, celebrated for charm and empathy in interviews, could be exacting, demanding, and sometimes intimidating behind the scenes. For the staff, the contrast was jarring. They had to reconcile admiration for the couple's public persona with the reality of private experience, all while performing flawlessly under pressure. A particularly telling moment occurred during a televised charity event. The public saw an effortlessly charming couple engaging with guests, smiling, and sharing witty remarks. Behind the scenes, aides had spent hours adjusting table placements, coordinating timing cues, and even repositioning decor to accommodate Harry's rituals and Meghan's specific preferences. Every element had to be meticulously orchestrated to preserve the illusion of spontaneity and grace. Staff described a sense of surreal dissonance. What appeared effortless to the world required immense labor, attention, and emotional energy behind the scenes. This dual reality extended into interactions with external partners and dignitaries. Insiders noted that Meghan and Harry's public-facing charm often masked high-intensity private negotiations, precise choreography, and insistence on perfect execution. Staff were left to reconcile these dynamics, ensuring that the public never glimpsed the friction or fatigue generated by the private side of the couple's behavior. It's also worth noting that the public-private dichotomy intensified the psychological strain on the aides. They were constantly aware that any misstep could disrupt the carefully curated image, yet adherence to private demands required a level of precision that tested human limits. Some aides reported feeling a constant sense of hyper-awareness, where every glance, step, or word was monitored internally for compliance. The stress was cumulative, with small errors magnified in significance, reinforcing the pressure to perform at an exacting level. The contrast between what was visible to the public and what occurred in private created ongoing tension. Staff had to navigate these extremes, balancing admiration, fear, and strategic compliance. They observed firsthand how Harry and Meghan managed perceptions, manipulating optics, interactions, and timing to ensure that only the most favorable narratives reached the outside world. Yet this careful orchestration came at a cost. Staff described moments of extreme exhaustion, emotional depletion, and even anxiety-induced mistakes. Some aides found themselves questioning their ability to continue in their roles. Others devised creative coping mechanisms, documenting events secretly, strategizing in quiet corners, or relying on subtle signals among trusted colleagues. The duality created a complex web of social dynamics, performance expectations, and psychological navigation that required constant attention. What became increasingly clear to insiders was that the public and private personas were intertwined but distinct. Harry and Meghan could charm, inspire, and engage in public while demanding exacting precision and ritual in private. For staff, the challenge was not just to survive, but to ensure that the public facade remained intact despite the chaos behind the scenes. This dichotomy reached its peak during an international tour, where public appearances were meticulously staged while private rituals and demands continued unabated. Staff described long hours, relentless anticipation, and the emotional roller coaster of maintaining order under extreme scrutiny. One aide reflected, "It felt like living in two worlds at once, the world the public saw and the world we had to manage behind the curtains. Both were equally real, and both demanded perfection." So the question arises, how much of what the public believes about the couple is curated image versus reality? How do aides cope with the constant tension between public expectation and private truth? And what happens when this duality begins to unravel under the weight of its own intensity? Have you ever wondered what happens when private rituals, once hidden behind closed doors, begin to dominate the daily life of an entire household? That's exactly what palace staff witnessed with Prince Harry, and the intensity of these rituals soon reached a point that could no longer be ignored. For months, the aides had observed patterns, meticulous movements, repeated sequences, and behaviors that seemed almost obsessive. But then, the rituals escalated, taking center stage in ways that disrupted routines, challenged hierarchy, and left staff scrambling to adapt in real time. It began subtly, almost imperceptibly, in the corridors and private chambers. Harry's rituals, previously confined to brief moments in his quarters, started to extend into spaces that intersected with staff duties. An aide recalled entering a room to adjust lighting and finding Harry in the middle of a sequence that involved pacing, precise hand gestures, and muttered phrases that seemed cryptic to anyone else. Staff froze, unsure whether to retreat, observe silently, or attempt to proceed with their duties. We never knew if we were intruding or assisting.